My name is Ezekiel Thorpe, wildlife officer in the Great Smoky Mountains. 7 days ago, my world changed when the silent infected appeared. I watched as they hunted in packs like the predators I once tracked. My expertise kept me alive while others fell. This is how I survived the first week of the silent zombie apocalypse, when the wilderness became our only sanctuary. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Ezekiel Thorpe, but everyone just calls me Zeke. I was a wildlife conservation officer in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I spent my days tracking predators, monitoring wildlife populations, and making sure the delicate balance of nature stayed intact. I lived alone in a cabin about 45 minutes from Knoxville, Tennessee. It was remote enough that I could go days without seeing another human being if I wanted to. And most days, I wanted to. I suppose I should mention what I look like, though it doesn't much matter anymore. I'm 34, tall and lean from years of hiking through mountain terrain. Got some nasty burn scars covering the right side of my face and neck. My right leg doesn't work quite right either, gives me a permanent limp. But I adapted. In the wild, adaptation is everything. I'm recording this 7 days after the first reported case in Tennessee. 7 days. That's all it took for everything to fall apart. What I've learned about predator behavior saved my life more than once this week. Might save yours too if you're still out there listening. It started on a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. I was making my morning coffee when the report came over the radio. Some new illness in Knoxville. They were calling it the silent sickness because victims lost their ability to speak before turning violent. I didn't think much of it. Media loves to hype these things up, right? Remember the bird flu panic? Swine flu? Always something. But then I got a call from Martinez, another ranger who worked the northeastern section of the park. He said the animals were acting strange. Deer herds moving in daylight, bears abandoning feeding grounds, birds gone quiet. In my 15 years working wildlife, I'd learned one thing for certain. When animals start acting abnormal, something's wrong. Nature knows before we do. Always. I decided to drive into town for supplies, just in case. The local market was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. People filling carts with water, canned goods, medicine. Not panic buying yet, but getting close. I overheard snippets of conversations. Someone's cousin in the Knoxville hospital, a nurse who hadn't come home from her shift, roads being closed on the outskirts of the city. At the gas station, I ran into Tom Harker. He owned the place, nice enough guy. We'd talk fishing whenever I stopped in. "Zeke, you hear about this thing in the city?" he asked while ringing up my jerky and coffee. "Just what's on the radio," I said. "You know anyone affected?" Tom shook his head. "My sister's boy works security at the hospital. Says they've got a whole floor quarantined. People not talking, just making these weird breathing sounds, attacking the nurses. Military's been called in." I remember thinking that sounded extreme for a new flu variant, but I thanked him, paid, and headed back to my cabin. First thing I did was check my emergency supplies. Habit from years living remote. I had about 3 weeks of food stored, water filters, first aid, ammunition for my hunting rifle, and basic tools. Not a doomsday prepper by any means, but prepared for the usual emergencies. Blizzards, forest fires, that sort of thing. That evening, I called my sister Rebecca. We weren't close, not since I moved to the mountains after what happened with the poachers. But she worked at the CDC in Atlanta, so I figured she might know something more about whatever was happening in Knoxville. "Becky, it's Zeke," I said when she picked up. "You heard about this thing in Tennessee?" There was a long pause. I can't talk about it, Zeke. Not officially. Since when have we been official with each other? She sighed. It's bad. Worse than they're saying. We've got similar reports from 4 other cities now. What is it? Some kind of super flu? I don't know yet. The progression is unlike anything I've seen. Fever, disorientation, loss of speech, and then... She trailed off. Look, I gotta go. We're working around the clock. Just stay in your cabin, okay? Filter your water. Don't come into any population centers. Filter my water? It's transmitted that way? I have to go, Zeke. I'll call when I can. That was the last time I spoke to my sister. The weather report that night mentioned a storm front moving in from the west. As I turned off the radio, the lights flickered once, twice. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. The first tremor before the earthquake. Wednesday morning, I woke up to the emergency broadcast tone on my radio. The announcement said the Tennessee Department of Health had established quarantine checkpoints around Knoxville. They described the symptoms in more detail. High fever, confusion, aphasia, that's the loss of speech, followed by extreme aggression. They stressed it wasn't airborne, but close contact with the infected should be avoided at all costs. I was pouring my coffee when my supervisor, Regional Director Wilson, called on the radio. Thorpe, you there? Over. I keyed the mic. Here, sir. What's the situation? Over. We've got campers and hikers all over the backcountry, and with this Knoxville situation, we need to account for everyone. Can you check the remote cabins in your sector? Make sure no one's showing symptoms? Over. Roger that. I'll head out now. Over. Be careful, Thorpe. We've got reports that some hikers might have come in contact with the infected before the quarantine. If you see anyone acting strange, keep your distance and radio in. Do not approach. Over. Understood. Over and out. I packed my day bag, water, protein bars, first aid kit, map, compass, radio, and my sidearm. Standard for backcountry patrol, though I'd never had to use the gun except for the occasional aggressive bear or injured animal. The forest felt different that day. Usually there's a constant backdrop of sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling, but it was quiet. Too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. I checked 3 cabins without incident, all empty, which was unusual for May. The 4th site was different. It was a primitive campsite near Abrams Creek, popular with hikers doing the long trails. As I approached, I noticed scraps of tent fabric scattered across the ground, food supplies thrown about, blood on some of the tree trunks. I drew my sidearm and moved cautiously. That's when I heard it, a wet, ragged breathing coming from behind a large boulder. "Park Service," I called out. "Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" The breathing got faster. Then a man lurched out from behind the rock. He was a hiker based on his clothes, but something was terribly wrong. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils hugely dilated. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, just that horrible breathing sound. When he saw me, he tilted his head at an unnatural angle. Then he charged. I've spent years learning how to safely restrain injured or aggressive animals. Those instincts kicked in. I sidestepped his charge, used his momentum to take him to the ground, and pinned him using techniques designed for large predators. He was burning up with fever, thrashing wildly beneath me. I managed to get my radio and call for medical evacuation. They said an ambulance would meet me at the nearest service road, about a mile away. Somehow, I got him restrained with zip ties from my pack and began the difficult process of moving him through the forest. He fought the entire way, making those terrible breathing sounds. No words, no recognition in his eyes, just Blind aggression. When we reached the service road, there was no ambulance. I waited an hour, continued calling on the radio. Nothing. That was when I truly understood something was seriously wrong. Park Service emergency protocols are rigid. An ambulance always comes. Always. I secured the man to a tree. Hated doing it, but I had no choice, and hiked up to a ridge where I could get cell reception. No signal. I tried the radio again, switching to emergency channels. What I heard chilled me to the bone. Reports of violence in hospitals all across East Tennessee. Medical staff attacked by patients. Quarantine zones breached. National Guard deployment requested. A dispatcher crying while reporting that infected had overrun her station. I looked back at the man secured to the tree. He was still struggling, still making those sounds. I had a decision to make. I couldn't take him with me, too dangerous. Couldn't leave him tied up indefinitely. Inhumane. And based on what I was hearing, there was no help coming. I won't tell you what decision I made, but I will say it was the first of many impossible choices in the days to come. And as I hiked back to my cabin that evening, watching more wildlife flee past me in the wrong season, heading the wrong direction, I knew in my gut that the world as I knew it was ending. The radio reports that night confirmed it. The infection was spreading faster than containment efforts could manage. Hospitals were overflowing. Violence in the streets. And still, no one knew exactly what this thing was or where it had come from. By Thursday morning, the emergency broadcasts had changed in tone. No longer advisory, now mandatory. Quarantine zones established around Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Nashville. The announcer's voice was tight. Controlled panic barely concealed beneath professional cadence. They started using the word infected instead of patients or the ill. That shift in language told me everything I needed to know. The symptoms were described in clinical detail now. Stage 1. High fever and disorientation lasting 6 to 12 hours. Stage 2. Complete loss of speech capability and increased agitation lasting 2 to 4 hours. Stage 3. Extreme aggression, particularly toward uninfected humans, with apparent coordination between infected individuals. The broadcast emphasized that once a person reached Stage 3, they should be considered extremely dangerous and beyond medical help at this time. I sat at my kitchen table, radio crackling, trying to process what that meant. Beyond medical help. A polite way of saying these people were gone, weren't coming back. The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. The radio squawked again. It was Wilson, my supervisor. "Thorpe, do you copy?" "Over." I grabbed the handset. "I copy. Go ahead. Over. We've lost contact with rangers in sectors 4 and 6. Last report said they were checking on hikers showing symptoms. I need you to investigate their last known locations. Approach with extreme caution. Over." "Sir, based on what I'm hearing, that sounds like a suicide mission." "Over." There was a long pause. "We don't leave our people behind, Thorpe. But I understand if you decline." Over. I closed my eyes. Thought about Martinez and Chen, the rangers who worked those sectors. Good people. "Send me the coordinates, I'll check it out. But I'm going armed." Over. "Understood. Be careful out there. And Thorpe, if you find them and they're not themselves anymore, you do what you have to do. Over and out." I gathered my gear meticulously. Extra ammunition for both my sidearm and hunting rifle. More emergency rations. Water purification tablets, first aid, survival blanket, map compass, binoculars, and my wildlife tracking kit, not standard issue, but something I'd assembled over years of predator studies. It included scent neutralizers, infrared monocular for night observation, and various tools for identifying tracks and marking territories. Little did I know those tracking tools, designed for studying wolves and bears, would become essential for tracking a new kind of predator in the days ahead. The coordinates led me to Martinez's ranger cabin first, about 7 miles from my own. The door was open when I arrived, swinging gently in the mountain breeze. Blood smeared the doorframe. Inside, supplies were scattered across the floor. No sign of Martinez. I found his logbook open on the desk. The last entry, written in hurried, messy script, responding to call about sick hikers at Chimney Top's trailhead. Radio contact lost with Chen, going to investigate. Chimney Tops was another 3 miles. I moved cautiously through the forest, staying off the main trails. The skills I'd honed tracking wildlife served me well. Every sound, every broken twig or disturbed patch of earth told a story. And the story I was reading was troubling. Multiple people moving erratically through the underbrush. Drag marks, more blood. I found Chen's truck at the trailhead parking lot. Driver's door open, radio torn from its mount. His personal pack still on the passenger seat, untouched. I did a careful survey of the area, rifle ready. The tracks told me at least 6 people had converged here. Some tracks showed normal gait, others showed an odd shuffling pattern I'd never seen before, like injured animals, but somehow worse. That was when I heard it. The same wet, ragged breathing I'd encountered with the infected hiker, only multiplied. Coming from further up the trail, I moved into the tree line using cover just as I would when observing wary predators. Through my binoculars, I saw them, a group of what had once been hikers, standing in a loose circle in a small clearing. In the center lay something I couldn't quite make out. They were hunched over it, making those terrible breathing sounds. I adjusted my position to get a better angle. What I saw made my blood run cold. The shape in the center was Chen, or what remained of him. And among the infected standing over him, I recognized Martinez's uniform. I felt bile rise in my throat. These were people I knew, had worked with for years, now reduced to this. I thought about the order Wilson had given me. Do what you have to do. But I couldn't, not from a distance, not without being certain. As I watched, trying to decide what to do, something extraordinary happened. Martinez's head snapped up, like he'd sensed something. The others followed his gaze, all turning in perfect unison to look in my direction. They hadn't seen me, couldn't have. I was well concealed and downwind. But somehow, they knew something was there. Martinez made a guttural sound, and the group began moving toward my position with that same unnatural, jerky gait. I retreated, fast and silent, the way you back away from a bear or mountain lion. Never running, never turning your back. Just steady, deliberate distance. They followed. Not directly tracking me, but moving in my general direction with unsettling purpose. I used every evasion tactic I knew. Crossed a stream to break my scent trail. Doubled back. Used dense undergrowth as cover. Eventually, I lost them, or they lost interest. I made it back to my cabin as dusk was falling, shaken to my core. The emergency broadcasts that evening were frantic. Reports of hospital violence had escalated to reports of coordinated attacks by groups of infected. The announcer said the National Guard had been deployed to major cities, with orders to establish safe zones and evacuate uninfected civilians. Then came the most disturbing report yet. Preliminary findings suggest the pathogen may be waterborne. Citizens are advised to avoid all tap water and natural water sources unless properly filtered and boiled. Repeat, do not consume unfiltered, unboiled water. My sister's warning echoed in my head. Filter your water. She'd known, or at least suspected from the beginning. I tried calling her again. No signal. The cell networks were either overwhelmed or down entirely. I switched to my emergency satellite phone, an expensive piece of equipment I rarely used but kept charged for true emergencies. It connected, but no one answered at her number. I left a message telling her I was safe, asking if she was too. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest set me on edge. I kept thinking about Martinez and Chen, about how the infected had moved like a single organism when they sensed me. It reminded me of wolfpack behavior, the way the entire group can shift direction based on cues from the alpha that humans can barely perceive. I'd spent years observing predators in the wild. I knew their patterns, their hunting strategies, their weaknesses. Now I found myself analyzing these infected the same way. They responded to sound. They moved in groups. They seemed to have some rudimentary form of communication. Most importantly, they hunted. Not for food, apparently, given what they'd done to Chen. Just to kill. I pulled out my field notebook and began jotting down observations, theories, possible defenses. If this thing was spreading as fast as it seemed, this information might be crucial in the days ahead. Dawn brought the sound of helicopters. Military, based on the rhythm of the rotors. They were heading toward Knoxville. I went outside, watched them pass overhead. 4 Blackhawks, flying low and fast. A few minutes later, I heard distant explosions from the direction of the city. The radio confirmed what I feared. The infection had spread too rapidly for conventional containment. The military was now implementing aggressive isolation protocols in urban centers. The broadcast didn't define what that meant, but the explosions told the story well enough. I spent that day fortifying my cabin as best I could. Boarded windows, reinforced doors, set up noise traps along the perimeter, simple arrangements of cans and wire that would sound if anything approached. I inventoried my ammunition, my food, my water. Tried the satellite phone again. Still no answer from my sister. As evening approached, I picked up chatter on the emergency frequencies. Civilians fleeing the cities. Roadblocks overwhelmed. Infected breaking through quarantine zones. A National Guard unit requesting immediate extraction after being surrounded. That night brought the first power outage. Just a flicker at first. Then off for 10 minutes. Then back on. The radio reported rolling blackouts to conserve emergency power. I knew it wouldn't be long before the grid failed completely. I slept in short bursts, rifle across my lap. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Martinez's face. Not as he had been, easygoing, always ready with a joke, but blank, inhuman, turning toward me with those empty eyes. In my dreams, he spoke to me, said things that made no sense, about the water, about how they could feel each other, know each other, move together, about how peaceful it was, not having to think anymore, just exist as part of something larger. I woke with a start at dawn, the dream still vivid. Something Martinez had said in the dream stuck with me. We can feel when you're watching. I thought about how the infected had seemed to sense my presence the day before, despite my concealment. Had they actually detected me somehow? Or was it coincidence? As a wildlife officer, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were screaming that these weren't just mindless, aggressive humans anymore. They were becoming something else, something that hunted, something that communicated, something that was adapting, just as all successful predators do. By Thursday afternoon, the highways leading out of Knoxville were completely jammed. I could see the main road from a ridge near my cabin, a solid line of vehicles barely moving, stretching for miles. People sat on their hoods, paced alongside their cars, or simply abandoned their vehicles altogether and continued on foot. From my vantage point with binoculars, they looked like ants fleeing a disturbed hill. I wasn't the only one watching. The mountains were suddenly crawling with unprepared city folk. They came in designer hiking boots and clean outdoor gear, carrying small backpacks with what they thought were adequate supplies. Most had no idea how to survive in the wilderness for more than a day. Under normal circumstances, my job would have been to help them, educate them, maybe issue a citation for camping outside designated areas. These weren't normal circumstances. I encountered a family that afternoon while checking my snare lines. A father, mother, and a girl about 10 years old. They were huddled beside a barely functional campfire, looking lost and terrified. The father jumped up when he saw me, placing himself between me and his family. "We have permits," he said quickly. "We're allowed to be here." I lowered my rifle slightly. "Not worried about permits right now. You folks get out of Knoxville?" He nodded. "Just barely." They were setting up roadblocks when we left. Military. Turning people back. "You have a vehicle?" "Abandoned it on the highway. Too much traffic, wasn't moving. We heard on the radio that the mountains might be safer." I looked at their minimal gear, their inappropriate clothing. The little girl was shivering despite the mild temperature. I noticed the mother keeping her slightly hidden behind her back. "Your daughter okay?" I asked. The parents exchanged a quick glance. The father spoke. "She's just tired. From the hike." I'd interviewed enough people in my career to recognize evasion. "She's not sick, is she?" "No," the mother said too quickly. "Just tired." I took a step back, raised my rifle slightly. Not pointing it at them, but ready. "I need to see her." The father's face hardened. "We told you. She's fine. Then you won't mind if I see for myself." For a moment, I thought he might rush me. Then his shoulders slumped. "She has a fever. Started this morning. But it's not that sickness. It can't be. We left before it got bad. We haven't been near any infected. She just has a regular fever." The mother gently turned the child around. The girl's face was flushed, eyes glassy with fever. But she met my gaze, recognized me as a person. No signs of the vacant stare I'd seen in the infected. I had a decision to make. I could send them away, the safest option for me. I could try to help them, dangerous if the girl was in the early stages of infection. Or I could do something more permanent, an option I wasn't ready to consider for a child who still seemed fully human. "There's a park ranger station about 2 miles north of here," I said finally. "It has medical supplies, radio equipment, clean water. I'll take you there." The relief on their faces was palpable. As we hiked, the father introduced himself as David, his wife as Sarah, and the girl as Emma. They were accountants from the suburbs. This camping trip was their first time in the mountains. They'd planned it months ago as a family adventure. The timing couldn't have been worse. At the ranger station, I found some children's acetaminophen and gave it to Emma. Her temperature was high, 102 according to the station's first aid kit thermometer, but not in the dangerous range reported for the infected. She was weak but lucid, asking questions, responding normally. I wanted to believe she just had a common illness. While Sarah attended to Emma, I tried the station's radio with David. We managed to reach someone at what sounded like a makeshift command center. The voice on the other end was abrupt, stressed. "We've got a family here," I said. "Child with fever, but showing no other symptoms of infection. What's the evacuation protocol?" "No evacuations at this time," the voice replied. "All resources dedicated to containment. Shelter in place if you're in a secure location." "This is a child," I pressed. "She needs medical attention." "Is she showing any signs of aphasia or aggression?" "No." "Then monitor and maintain isolation. If symptoms progress, follow Containment Protocol Delta." "What's Containment Protocol Delta?" I asked. The radio went silent for a moment. Permanent neutralization of the threat. I repeat, if symptoms progress to stage 2, permanent neutralization is authorized and recommended. David's face went ashen. I switched off the radio. They can't mean... He started. They do, I said quietly. But we're not there yet. Emma's talking. She's aware. Let's focus on getting her fever down. We spent the night at the ranger station. I kept first watch while the family slept huddled together on cots in the back room. Around midnight, I tried calling my sister again on the satellite phone. This time, someone answered, but it wasn't Rebecca. CDC Emergency Operations, a man's voice said. I'm trying to reach Dr. Rebecca Thorpe, I said. Who is this? Her brother, Ezekiel Thorpe. Park Service, Great Smoky Mountains. There was a pause. 1 moment. I waited, heart pounding. Finally, another voice came on the line. Female, but not my sister. Mr. Thorpe, this is Dr. Levine. I worked with your sister. The past tense wasn't lost on me. Where is she? I'm sorry. Dr. Thorpe was part of the team studying the first cases when containment was breached. We lost contact with that entire lab section 24 hours ago. My throat tightened. Was she infected? We don't know. The entire section was locked down automatically when the breach was detected. No one has been able to get in or out since. What can you tell me about this thing? The infection? Dr. Levine hesitated. Officially, very little. Unofficially, it appears to be a prion-based pathogen with unusual properties. It's waterborne, primarily spread through municipal water systems. Once in the body, it attacks the speech centers first, then emotional regulation, then higher cognitive functions. My sister mentioned water contamination when we last spoke. She was right. She was always right. The woman's voice cracked slightly. Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Rebecca would want you to know. The infected aren't dead. They're still alive, but the prion has rewired their brains. It's created new neural pathways. They can't speak or think individually anymore, but they can communicate with each other through some mechanism we don't fully understand. Like a hive mind, I said, remembering how the infected had moved in unison. Something like that. And it's spreading faster than anyone anticipated. Major cities in the eastern U.S. are already at critical infection rates above 50%. The military is establishing quarantine zones, but... She trailed off. But it's too late, I finished for her. Yes, I think it is. She paused. Are you somewhere safe? Away from population centers? For now. I've got clean water, supplies. Stay there as long as you can. This thing burns through dense populations like wildfire, but isolated individuals have better chances. She lowered her voice. I have to go. They're evacuating essential personnel to a secure facility. If Rebecca makes contact, or if we can secure that lab section, I'll try to get word to you. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of the ranger station, the satellite phone heavy in my hand. My sister was either dead, infected, or trapped. No way to know which. No way to help her. Dawn came with Emma's fever higher still. Her speech was slightly slurred now, but she was still communicating, still recognizing her parents. I didn't share what I'd learned about the infection with David and Sarah. No point adding to their terror. Instead, I helped them pack supplies for a longer stay in the mountains. There's a cabin about 5 miles deeper into the park, I told them. It's remote, has its own well water that should be safe, solar power for basics. You can hole up there until Emma recovers and things calm down. You're not coming with us? Sarah asked. I shook my head. I need to try to reach my sister. But I'll get you set up first. As we prepared to leave, I picked up chatter on the radio. Military frequencies. discussing containment failures and escalating the response. One transmission chilled me. Authorization received for Contingency Ember. Repeat. Contingency Ember is now active. All units clear the red zone for aerial deployment. I didn't know what Contingency Ember was, but it sounded like the kind of last resort that comes with significant collateral damage. We needed to move quickly. We were about a mile from the ranger station when we heard the jets. Fighter aircraft, flying low and fast toward Knoxville. David looked at me, question in his eyes. "Keep moving," I said. "Don't look back." But we all looked back when the sound came. Not an explosion exactly. More like a massive rushing of air, followed by a deep, sustained roar. Over the tree line we saw it, a wall of flame engulfing the distant city, rising higher than seemed possible. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, clutching Emma close. "They're burning it." "Incendiary purge," I said, more to myself than to them. "They're trying to sterilize the infection zone." We watched in silent horror as Knoxville burned. Even from this distance, the heat was palpable. Ash began to fall around us like black snow. "We need to keep moving," I finally said. "The cabin is northwest, away from the city in the wind direction. We should be safe from the smoke and fallout there." As we hiked, Emma's condition worsened. Her fever spiked higher. Her words became more jumbled. By the time we reached the cabin in the late afternoon, she could only manage single words, often inappropriate ones. Stage 2 was beginning. I knew what the voice on the radio had meant by permanent neutralization. I also knew I couldn't do it. Couldn't even suggest it to her parents, who looked at her with desperate hope every time she managed to say something that made sense. I got them settled in the cabin, showed them the well pump, the solar setup, the emergency supplies. Then I prepared to leave. "You can't go now," David pleaded. "Not with Emma like this. We don't know what to do if she gets worse." The truth was, I didn't want to be there when Emma fully transitioned. Didn't want to make the choice that would inevitably come. Didn't want to watch her parents face it. Cowardly, perhaps, but human. "I have to try to find my sister," I said, "and I have radios for us to stay in contact." I handed him one of my spare handhelds. "Channel 3, check in every 6 hours. If I don't hear from you, I'll come back." We both knew it was a lie. If they stopped checking in, it would mean only one thing. I wouldn't be coming back to that cabin. Not ever. As I hiked away, I heard Emma call out something that might have been bye, or might have been nothing at all. Her last word, possibly. I didn't look back. Friday brought a sky darkened by smoke and ash. The forest that had been my home for years felt suddenly alien, transformed by what was happening around it. As I hiked back toward my cabin, I kept thinking about Emma and her parents, about my sister trapped in that CDC lab, about the wall of fire consuming Knoxville. The world was unraveling, and all I could do was keep moving. I encountered more refugees from the city as I traveled. Most were in bad shape, exhausted, dehydrated, some injured. I helped where I could, sharing water purification tablets, offering directions to ranger stations with supplies, but I didn't invite any of them to join me. Couldn't risk it. Not after Emma. Not knowing how quickly the infection could manifest. By midday, I reached a high ridge that gave me a clear view of the surrounding area. The smoke from Knoxville formed a dark ceiling to the east. To the south, I could see another plume rising, Chattanooga, most likely. The military was implementing their aggressive isolation protocols with ruthless efficiency. I scanned the highways with my binoculars. The traffic jams had evolved into abandoned vehicle graveyards. People were moving on foot now, streaming into the forests and mountains. Some traveled in groups, others alone. All potential carriers. That was when I spotted the first organized group of infected. They moved differently than the scattered ones I'd encountered before. More coordinated, almost military in their formation. A group of about 20 moving steadily along a hiking trail below my position. At their center was someone in what looked like a park ranger uniform. Not Martinez or Chen, someone else. They were heading northwest, deeper into the mountains, deeper into what had been safe territory. I used my wildlife observation techniques to track them from a distance. They moved with purpose, not the random wandering I'd seen from the initial infected. They would stop periodically, and the uniformed one would make a strange gesture, head lifted, mouth open as if scenting the air. Then the group would adjust course slightly. They were hunting, tracking, following something or someone. I kept parallel to them for about 2 miles, staying downwind and out of sight. Then they encountered a small camp of survivors, a family with 2 teenage boys who had set up beside a stream. What happened next will haunt me forever. The infected didn't immediately attack. They surrounded the camp with an eerie precision, cutting off escape routes. The uniformed one approached alone while the others remained hidden. The family, seeing what appeared to be a park ranger, looked relieved. They stood to greet him. I was too far away to warn them, too far to help. I could only watch through my binoculars as the ranger stooped forward in that unnatural way, then made a guttural sound. At that signal, the rest of the infected swarmed the camp. It was over in minutes. The family never had a chance. Afterward, the infected did something I hadn't seen before. They stood in a circle around the bodies, heads tilted at identical angles, making those breathing sounds in unison, like they were communicating or celebrating. Then the uniformed one looked up, directly toward my hidden position on the ridge. Once again, impossibly, they had sensed observation. The entire group turned as one and began moving in my direction. I retreated immediately, using every evasion tactic I knew. I crossed streams, doubled back, used dense brush for cover. Still, they followed, not tracking by sight or even scent, but somehow sensing my presence, my direction. It was as if they could feel the living mind observing them. I finally lost them by descending into a network of narrow ravines where the water flow would mask any traces. By then I was miles off course and the sun was setting. I needed shelter for the night. There was a hunter's blind I knew of nearby, a small elevated platform used during deer season. It wasn't much, but it was off the ground and provided some concealment. I climbed up just as darkness fell completely. From my perch, I could see fires burning in the distance. Not just the cities now, but smaller fires throughout the forest. Other survivors making a fundamental mistake. Fire meant visibility. Visibility meant death. I ate a protein bar in the darkness, sipped carefully rationed water, and tried to process what I'd witnessed. The infected were evolving, organizing, using tactics, and somehow they could sense observation in a way that defied explanation. I thought about what Dr. Levine had said about neural rewiring, about new pathways forming. Was this the result? Some kind of heightened awareness that normal humans lacked? The radio broadcasts were becoming less frequent, more chaotic. Different voices cutting in, often talking over each other. Emergency protocols abandoned. Some channels had gone silent entirely. On the ones still active, the news was grim. Major cities along the eastern seaboard declared lost. Military falling back to establish defensive perimeters around designated safe zones. Unconfirmed reports of infected showing increased cognitive functions, including tool use and coordinated attacks. I tried the satellite phone again, hoping to reach Dr. Levine or anyone who might have news about Rebecca. The network was still operational, but no one answered at the CDC number. I left another message, knowing it would likely never be heard. As full night descended, the sounds of the forest changed. The normal nocturnal chorus of insects and frogs fell silent whenever certain movements passed nearby. I could track the progress of the infected through the woods by following that wave of silence. They were everywhere now, moving through the darkness with that steady, relentless purpose. I dozed fitfully, waking at every sound. Near dawn, I was jolted fully awake by a child's scream somewhere in the forest. Then more screams, abruptly cut off. I gripped my rifle tighter and remained perfectly still, controlling my breathing the way I'd been trained. Movement meant detection. Detection meant death. As the first light filtered through the trees, I carefully surveyed my surroundings before descending from the blind. No sign of infected nearby. I set off toward my cabin again, moving with the caution of a hunted animal. I reached my property by mid-morning. Everything looked undisturbed at first glance, but my trained eye caught subtle signs of intrusion. A broken twig on the path, a smudge in the dust on the porch. Someone or something had been there. I approached cautiously, rifle ready. The door was still locked, windows intact. Using my key, I entered slowly, checking each room. Nothing appeared disturbed inside, but there was a feeling in the air. A presence that had been and gone. I've spent enough time tracking animals to recognize when a predator has marked territory. My cabin wasn't just my refuge anymore. It had been found. I moved quickly, gathering essential supplies. More ammunition, water filters, first aid, my detailed maps of the region, the solar charger for my radio and satellite phone, winter gear in case I needed to move to higher elevations. All went into my largest pack, carefully balanced for a potentially long journey. As I worked, I kept thinking about what I'd seen. The coordinated hunting party. The way they had sensed me watching. Their ritualistic behavior after the kill. These weren't mindless infected anymore. They were becoming something else. Something organized. Something that communicated and coordinated. Something that hunted. I needed to understand them better if I was going to survive. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I prepared to study this new predator systematically. From my wildlife observation gear, I took motion sensors, small cameras, and tracking markers. I had used these tools to study wolf pack movements and bear hunting patterns. Now I would use them to document something far more dangerous. Before leaving, I set up a system of perimeter alarms around the cabin. Not to protect it, I knew I wouldn't be coming back, but to gather data. Simple tripwires connected to battery-powered transmitters that would send signals to a receiver I carried. Each alarm was numbered and marked on my map. If they triggered, I would know where the infected were moving, how many, and when. I looked around the cabin one last time. This had been my home for nearly a decade, the place I'd retreated to after the incident with the poachers that left me scarred and limping. My sanctuary from a world that had become too complicated, too crowded, too detached from natural rhythms. Now that world was gone, replaced by something even more hostile. Just before departing, I left a note pinned to the door. Not that the infected could read it, but on the off chance any uninfected passed by, water contaminated. Infection spreads through water. Filter everything or boil 10+ minutes. Simple information that might save lives. I headed out into the forest, away from established trails, moving carefully and quietly. My destination was Klingman's Dome, the highest point in the Smokies. From there, I could get a better view of what was happening across the region. Might even be able to spot any organized human resistance or evacuation points. The observation tower there also offered a defensible position with good visibility in all directions. The hike would normally take about a day. With the need for stealth and caution, I estimated 2 or 3. I planned to move during daylight when visibility was good, find secure elevated positions to rest at night. Basic predator avoidance strategy adapted for this new threat. As I hiked, my perimeter alarm receiver beeped softly. I checked the display. Alarm number 3, the one on the eastern approach to my cabin, triggered by at least 4 separate movements. They had arrived, exactly as I expected. I made a note in my field book. Time, location, number. Data that might reveal patterns. By late afternoon, I had covered about 7 miles of difficult terrain, staying off trails, using streams and rocky areas to mask my passage. I found a rock overhang that offered good cover for the night, with a fallen tree providing additional concealment. As I was setting up my minimal camp, another alarm triggered. Number 7, the western perimeter. More infected approaching my cabin from a different direction. That wasn't random movement. They were converging from multiple directions, coordinating, hunting. I ate sparingly, rationing my supplies. The forest would provide additional food. I knew what plants were edible, could set snares for small game, but for now, preserved rations were safest and most efficient. As darkness fell, I saw more fires in the distance, fewer than the previous night. Either people were learning to avoid detection, or there were simply fewer people left to make fires. Neither possibility was comforting. I checked the radio one more time before settling in for the night. Most channels were silent now. On one emergency frequency, a lone voice was broadcasting on a loop. Safe zone established at Cherokee National Forest headquarters. Military protection, medical facilities, clean water, approach from the north with hands visible. Cherokee headquarters was about 40 miles from my position. A possible destination, if the safe zone was still there by the time I could reach it. I marked it on my map as a potential objective after Klingman's Dome. The night was unnaturally quiet. No owls. No rustling of nocturnal creatures. Just the occasional distant scream or gunshot echoing through the mountains. Humanity's last stand playing out in isolated pockets across the landscape. In the darkness, I thought about Emma and her family. Hoped they had found peace, one way or another. Thought about my sister, trapped in that CDC lab. Wondered if she was still fighting, still searching for answers. Or if she had become one of them, her brilliant mind reduced to that primitive, collective consciousness that now hunted through the night. I dozed fitfully, waking at every sound, rifle close at hand. The world I had known was gone. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new insights into this evolving threat. All I could do was adapt, observe, learn, survive, just like any animal facing a new apex predator. Saturday morning dawned gray and hazy, the sun barely visible through the mix of smoke and fog that had settled over the mountains. I awoke, stiff and alert, my body tense even in sleep. Years of wilderness training had taught me to wake fully conscious, already assessing my surroundings. That training was keeping me alive now. My perimeter alarm receiver had been quiet through the night. The infected had converged on my cabin but hadn't moved beyond it yet. I made another note in my field book, adding to the data I was collecting. Understanding their movement patterns could be the difference between life and death. I performed a careful check of my immediate area before emerging from my shelter. No signs of human or infected presence. Still, I moved cautiously, making my breakfast of a protein bar and filtered water while scanning constantly for movement. In the wilderness, complacency kills. That was true even before the world fell apart. As I packed up my minimal camp, I thought about my next moves. Klingman's Dome was still my objective. High ground, good visibility, defensible. But I needed to be smart about how I got there. The infected seemed to be developing some kind of territorial awareness. They converged on places where humans had been, perhaps attracted by lingering scents or some other marker I didn't yet understand. I decided to modify my route, choosing paths that would be difficult for groups to follow. Steep ravines, dense rhododendron thickets, rocky creek beds, terrain that would slow or separate the pack-like formations I'd observed. Before setting out, I checked each of my weapons. The hunting rifle, accurate at long range but limited in ammunition. My sidearm, a Glock 22 issued to all wildlife officers with 3 spare magazines. And my backup, a compound bow with carbon arrows. Silent, reusable, and deadly in the right hands. Mine were the right hands. I'd been a competitive archer before joining the Park Service. I set off heading west by northwest, moving uphill through a series of switchbacks that would be difficult to track. The morning was unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the natural world was holding its breath. Around midday, I paused at a small stream to refill my water bottles. I used a multi-stage filtration system, first through a cloth to remove particulates, then through a ceramic filter to remove bacteria and most viruses, then chemical treatment as a final precaution. Dr. Levine had said the infection was waterborne. I wasn't taking any chances. As I waited for the chemicals to work, I listened to the forest. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of movement downstream. Too deliberate for an animal. Too careful for a panicked survivor. I silently packed my gear and moved into cover, positioning myself behind a large oak with good sight lines. They came into view a few minutes later. 3 infected, moving along the stream bed. 2 wore hiking clothes, one the uniform of a park concessionaire who had probably worked at one of the visitor centers. They moved with that now familiar jerky gait, heads swiveling in unison, those wet breathing sounds audible even at this distance. What struck me was their behavior. They weren't wandering randomly. They were searching methodically, checking deeper pools in the stream, examining the banks. Looking for something. For someone. For water sources where survivors might come. They were setting an ambush. I remained perfectly still as they passed my position, not 30 feet away, close enough to see their faces clearly. The vacant eyes, the slack expressions, but also something new. A kind of alertness that hadn't been present in the first infected I'd encountered. They were evolving, becoming more efficient predators. Once they were well past my position, I continued on my route, now even more cautious about water sources. If the infected were staking out streams and springs, survival just got exponentially more difficult. Water is the one resource you cannot do without, cannot substitute, cannot risk. By late afternoon, I had covered another 8 miles of rough terrain. My leg was throbbing from the old injury, aggravated by the difficult hiking. But I'd made good progress toward Klingman's Dome. I found a suitable location for the night, a rocky outcrop with clear views of the approaches and limited access points that I could monitor. As I set up my minimal camp, I took stock of my supplies. Food for another week if I rationed carefully, water for 2 days before I'd need to find more, ammunition sufficient if I was conservative. First aid supplies that would handle minor injuries but nothing serious. No margin for error, no room for mistakes. I checked my perimeter alarm receiver again. Several more had triggered throughout the day. The infected were expanding outward from my cabin in a search pattern. Methodical, coordinated, learning. The radio frequencies were almost completely silent now. Just one emergency broadcast still running on a loop, the same message about the Cherokee National Forest safe zone. No updates, no new information. For all I knew, it was an automated system continuing to broadcast after the humans operating it were long gone. As the light faded, I allowed myself to think about the burn scars that covered the right side of my face and neck, about the limp that had become part of my identity, about the day that had changed everything. It had been 5 years ago. I was investigating reports of poachers targeting black bears in a remote section of the park. Bears killed just for their gallbladders, which fetch high prices in certain markets. A wasteful, cruel practice that I dedicated my career to stopping. I'd located their camp and was documenting their operation from a hidden position when something went wrong. They had more men than I'd anticipated, and one circled behind my location. I was discovered, outnumbered, and they were armed with high-powered rifles. What followed was a firefight, a chase through the forest, and finally a standoff at an abandoned cabin. They set it on fire with me inside. I escaped, but not before the flames claimed part of me, not before a bullet shattered my right femur. 3 poachers died that day, 2 by my hand, 1 in the fire that consumed the cabin. I was cleared in the investigation, justified use of force in the line of duty. But the incident changed me, made me withdraw further into the wilderness, made me understand that humans could be the most dangerous predators of all. Now, as I watch the darkness settle over the mountains, I recognize that I'd been preparing for this apocalypse my entire career, learning to track predators, to understand their behavior patterns, to think like them in order to protect others from them. Only now, the predators were human, or had been. As night closed in completely, I saw more fires in the distance, fewer than the previous night, much fewer. People were either learning to hide better or there were fewer people left. Based on what I'd seen, I feared it was the latter. I ate sparingly by the light of the stars. Another protein bar, a handful of dried fruit, carefully rationed water. Tomorrow would bring more difficult terrain, more careful navigation of a landscape that had transformed from my sanctuary into hunting grounds where I was the prey. From my elevated position, I could see movement in the valleys below. Small groups of infected moving through the darkness. Their patterns had a purpose now, a deliberate quality that sent chills through me. They moved like wolf packs on a scent trail, circling, closing in, communicating somehow despite their inability to speak. I thought about what Dr. Levine had said about neural rewiring, about the prion creating new pathways in the brain. What if it wasn't just destroying higher functions? What if it was replacing them with something else? Something more primitive, but also more connected. In nature, many organisms operate with collective intelligence. Ant colonies, beehives, schools of fish that move as a single entity. No individual thinking required, just chemical signals and hardwired responses. Efficient, lethal in their simplicity. Were the infected becoming something like that? A human hive mind? The thought was terrifying in its implications. I checked my weapons again before settling in for the night. The rifle within easy reach, the sidearm under my makeshift pillow, the bow and arrows ready for silent defense if needed. I had established a perimeter of simple alarms, stones balanced on sticks that would fall with a distinctive sound if disturbed. Not electronic, nothing to drain batteries, just basic woodcraft. Sleep came in brief intervals, my body trained through years in the wilderness to wake at the slightest unusual sound. Each time I opened my eyes, I saw more movement in the valleys below, more infected joining the hunt. Near dawn, I was awakened by a different sound. Helicopter rotors, military, based on the rhythm and depth of the sound. Multiple aircraft moving fast and low over the mountains to the northeast, toward Cherokee National Forest where the safe zone was supposedly established. I watched their lights cross the sky, then disappear beyond the ridgeline. Minutes later, the distant crackle of gunfire echoed across the valleys. Heavy weapons, sustained fire, then silence. I waited, watching the horizon. No return flight, no continuing sounds of battle, just silence, Whether that meant success or failure, rescue or annihilation, I couldn't tell. But the absence of continuing combat suggested the latter. The safe zone at Cherokee was likely no longer safe, if it ever had been. I was on my own. As the first light of Sunday morning painted the ridges in pale gold, I packed up my small camp and prepared to continue toward Klingman's Dome. The tower there would give me visibility, information, options. I checked my map, plotting the day's route carefully to avoid likely infected concentrations based on the movements I'd observed. My years tracking wolf packs were proving invaluable now. Understanding predator behavior patterns might be the only thing keeping me alive. Before leaving my rocky shelter, I took one more look at the world below. The forests that had been my home, the mountains that had been my sanctuary, all transformed now into something dangerous and strange. Yet in that moment, I felt an odd sense of clarity, of purpose. In a world of predator and prey, I knew which role I intended to play. Not just survivor, but observer, tracker, hunter if necessary. The wilderness had taught me that adaptation is everything. The strong survive not by strength alone, but by understanding, by learning, by changing in response to threat. I shouldered my pack, checked my weapons, and began the day's journey, higher into the mountains, away from the spreading infection below, toward whatever future remained in this broken world. Sunday brought a strange calm to the mountains. They set it on fire with me inside. I escaped, but not before the flames claimed part of me, not before a bullet shattered my right femur. 3 poachers died that day, 2 by my hand, 1 in the fire that consumed the cabin. I was cleared in the investigation, justified use of force in the line of duty. But the incident changed me, made me withdraw further into the wilderness, made me understand that humans could be the most dangerous predators of all. Now, as I watched the darkness settle over the mountains, I recognized that I'd been preparing for this apocalypse my entire career, learning to track predators, to understand their behavior patterns, to think like them in order to protect others from them. Only now, the predators were human, or had been. As night closed in completely, I saw more fires in the distance, fewer than the previous night, much fewer. People were either learning to hide better or there were fewer people left. Based on what I'd seen, I feared it was the latter. I ate sparingly by the light of the stars. Another protein bar, a handful of dried fruit, carefully rationed water. Tomorrow would bring more difficult terrain, more careful navigation of a landscape that had transformed from my sanctuary into hunting grounds where I was the prey. From my elevated position, I could see movement in the valleys below. Small groups of infected moving through the darkness. Their patterns had a purpose now, a deliberate quality that sent chills through me. They moved like wolf packs on a scent trail, circling, closing in, communicating somehow despite their inability to speak. I thought about what Dr. Levine had said about neural rewiring, about the prion creating new pathways in the brain. What if it wasn't just destroying higher functions? What if it was replacing them with something else? Something more primitive, but also more connected. In nature, many organisms operate with collective intelligence. Ant colonies, beehives, schools of fish that move as a single entity. No individual thinking required, just chemical signals and hardwired responses. Efficient, lethal in their simplicity. Were the infected becoming something like that? A human hive mind? The thought was terrifying in its implications. I checked my weapons again before settling in for the night. The rifle within easy reach, the sidearm under my makeshift pillow, the bow and arrows ready for silent defense if needed. I had established a perimeter of simple alarms, Stones balanced on sticks that would fall with a distinctive sound if disturbed. Not electronic, nothing to drain batteries, just basic woodcraft. Sleep came in brief intervals. My body trained through years in the wilderness to wake at the slightest unusual sound. Each time I opened my eyes, I saw more movement in the valleys below, more infected joining the hunt. Near dawn, I was awakened by a different sound. Helicopter rotors. Military, based on the rhythm and depth of the sound. Multiple aircraft moving fast and low over the mountains to the northeast, toward Cherokee National Forest where the safe zone was supposedly established. I watched their lights cross the sky, then disappear beyond the ridgeline. Minutes later, the distant crackle of gunfire echoed across the valleys. Heavy weapons, sustained fire, then silence. I waited, watching the horizon. No return flight, no continuing sounds of battle, just silence. Whether that meant success or failure, rescue or annihilation, I couldn't tell. But the absence of continuing combat suggested the latter. The safe zone at Cherokee was likely no longer safe, if it ever had been. I was on my own. As the first light of Sunday morning painted the ridges in pale gold, I packed up my small camp and prepared to continue toward Klingman's Dome. The tower there would give me visibility, information, options. I checked my map, plotting the day's route carefully to avoid likely infected concentrations based on the movements I'd observed. My years tracking wolf packs were proving invaluable now. Understanding predator behavior patterns might be the only thing keeping me alive. Before leaving my rocky shelter, I took one more look at the world below. The forests that had been my home, the mountains that had been my sanctuary, all transformed now into something dangerous and strange. Yet in that moment, I felt an odd sense of clarity, of purpose. In a world of predator and prey, I knew which role I intended to play. Not just survivor, but observer, tracker, hunter if necessary. The wilderness had taught me that adaptation is everything. The strong survive not by strength alone, but by understanding, by learning, by changing in response to threat. I shouldered my pack, checked my weapons, and began the day's journey, higher into the mountains, away from the spreading infection below, toward whatever future remained in this broken world. Sunday brought a strange calm to the mountains. The entire group turned as one, staring in my direction. I remained perfectly still, controlling my breathing, my thoughts, my fear. After what seemed an eternity, they returned to their examination of the camp, but the hunter dispatched 4 of the infected in my general direction. They began moving uphill, spreading out in a search pattern. I retreated carefully, using every evasion technique I knew. Crossed rocky ground that would leave no tracks. Used streams to mask my scent. Changed direction repeatedly. It took hours of careful movement to be certain I'd lost them. By then, it was late afternoon, and I was off my planned route to Klingman's Dome. I found myself in an area of the park I knew less well. Still familiar from my years of patrols, but not as intimately as my usual territory. I needed shelter for the night. After searching carefully, I found a small cave entrance partially hidden by fallen trees. I examined it thoroughly with my flashlight before entering. No signs of animal habitation, no other entrances or hidden chambers where infected might lurk. The cave was shallow but provided good cover and a defensible position. I set up minimal camp and took inventory of my supplies. Food was holding out. Water would need replenishing soon. Ammunition was becoming a concern. I had used none yet, but had less than I'd like if confronted by a large group of infected. As darkness fell, I tried the radio again. Nothing but static on most frequencies. The broadcast about the Cherokee safe zone had finally gone silent. On one emergency channel, I heard fragmentary transmissions. Something about a final evacuation from the coast, naval vessels, offshore sanctuary. Too broken to get details, too distant to matter for my immediate survival. I checked the satellite phone as well. Battery still good, but no answer at any of the numbers I tried. The network itself seemed to be operating, which suggested at least some infrastructure remained intact. But who was left to answer was another question entirely. In the darkness of the cave, with just the faint glow of my covered flashlight, I examined the burn scars on my arm and hand, traced the ridges of warped flesh that had become part of my identity. The physical pain had faded years ago. The memory remained sharp. The poachers had been a Colombian crew operating across the southeast, part of a larger black market network trafficking in bear gallbladders and other animal parts. I'd tracked them for weeks, documented their kills, their camps, their routes. I had been prepared, or so I thought, had called for backup, had followed protocol, but the backup never came. Later, I learned there had been a miscommunication, a jurisdiction dispute between agencies. Politics while I bled in the burning cabin. I survived through sheer stubbornness, crawled out through a back window after the roof collapsed, dragged myself 3 miles to a service road with a shattered femur and third-degree burns, was found by a maintenance crew the next morning, barely alive. 6 months of surgeries, physical therapy, skin grafts, another 3 months before I could walk unassisted. And then the decision: return to regular duty or accept a position as a wildlife officer in the most remote section of the park, away from people, away from the politics and bureaucracy that had nearly killed me. I chose the wilderness, chose solitude. Never regretted it, especially now. That training, that experience, had prepared me for this in ways I couldn't have imagined. The wilderness taught lessons that were keeping me alive: patience, observation, respect for predators, understanding that survival often means avoiding conflict rather than winning it. I ate a small meal in the darkness, carefully rationed jerky, dried fruit, filtered water. My body had adapted to less frequent meals over years of long backcountry patrols. Another advantage. Outside, I could hear movement in the forest. The infected were active at night, perhaps hunting by sound more than sight. I kept absolutely silent, even controlling my breathing to make it shallow and inaudible. Through the cave entrance, I could see fires burning in the distance again. Survivors still making fundamental mistakes, still announcing their presence to the predators that now ruled these mountains. I thought about David, Sarah, and Emma. How quickly they had transformed from victims to predators, how seamlessly they had integrated into the larger group, how Emma had somehow taken a leadership role. There was a hierarchy forming among the infected, a structure, a purpose. These weren't mindless zombies from movies. They were something else, something organized, something that learned and adapted, something that communicated through means I couldn't yet understand. As I sat in the darkness, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if the infection wasn't destroying humanity? What if it was replacing it with something else? Something more primitive, but also more connected. A collective consciousness without individual fears or doubts or hesitations. In nature, individual intelligence is often less efficient than collective behavior. Ants accomplish incredible engineering feats without a single ant understanding the overall design. Fish swim in schools that change direction instantaneously without any fish making a decision. Efficient, unified, purpose-driven. Was that what I was witnessing? The birth of a human hive mind? The thought was both fascinating and terrifying. I dozed fitfully through the night, awaking at every sound from the forest outside. Each time, I assessed, evaluated, planned potential responses. The predator mindset that had become second nature during my years tracking wildlife now applied to my own survival. Near dawn, I heard gunshots in the distance, sporadic at first, then sustained fire, then silence. Another group of survivors discovered, another resistance overcome. As the first light filtered into the cave, I prepared to move again. Klingman's dome was still my objective, though I would need to adjust my route based on yesterday's encounter. The higher elevations might offer safety simply because they were less hospitable. Fewer resources for survivors meant fewer targets for the infected to hunt. Before leaving the cave, I examined my map carefully, plotting 3 potential routes: primary, secondary, emergency fallback. Always have options. Always have an escape plan. Basic survival in predator territory. I shouldered my pack, checked my weapons, and stepped out into the dawn light. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no small animals moving in the underbrush. Just the sound of the wind in the pines and the weight of silence pressing down from all sides. Another day of survival in this new world. Another day of watching, learning, adapting. Another day of becoming the kind of predator that could survive among predators. Because that's what this was now. Not an infection, not a disaster, not a temporary emergency. This was evolution. Brutal, efficient, and indifferent to the individual lives it consumed in service of whatever came next. Sunday brought a strange calm to the mountains. The smoke had settled into the valleys, creating a gray sea with only the highest ridges rising above like islands. As I hiked upward toward Klingman's dome, I felt like I was ascending above the apocalypse, watching it unfold below me as if from another world. The higher I climbed, the fewer signs of human presence I encountered. No refugees from the cities, no survivors making basic wilderness mistakes, no infected hunting packs, just the emptiness of the high country and the weight of solitude. Around midday, I reached a scenic overlook that gave me a clear view to the east. Knoxville was still burning, the smoke column wider now, spreading like a dark stain across the horizon. Further south, I could see other fires. Chattanooga, possibly Atlanta beyond that. The world was burning while I climbed ever higher into the clean air of the mountains. I paused to rest my leg and check my perimeter alarm receiver. Most had triggered by now, showing a clear expansion pattern from my cabin outward in concentric circles. The infected were moving with purpose, searching systematically. I recorded the data in my field book, adding it to my growing understanding of their behavior. When I looked up from my notes, I saw them. The family I'd been dreading finding, the one I'd left at the remote cabin. David, Sarah, and Emma. They were moving along a ridge about half a mile away, heading north. All 3 were infected now, moving with that distinctive jerky gait, heads swiveling in unison. Emma was at the front, leading them. That struck me as significant. In the infected groups I'd observed previously, the apparent leaders had been adults, often those with some survival or orientation skills in their previous lives, rangers, military, hunters. Yet here was a child leading. Perhaps because she'd turned first, had been infected longest. I watched them through my binoculars, documenting their movements. They paused occasionally, and Emma would make that now familiar head-tilted posture, as if scenting the air. Then they would adjust course slightly. They were tracking something or someone. I should have continued on my way, should have avoided any contact, any risk. That would have been the smart play, the survival move. But I felt responsible for them. I had left them in that cabin, knowing what would likely happen. I needed to understand. So I shadowed them, staying downwind and out of sight, using the forest cover to mask my movements. They traveled with surprising speed despite their awkward movements, heading steadily northward. After about 2 miles, they joined a larger group of infected, perhaps 15 total, led by someone in hunting camouflage. What I witnessed next confirmed my worst fears about the evolving nature of the infection. The two groups merged seamlessly without any visible communication, moving together as if they'd always been a single unit. The hunter took the lead position from Emma, but she remained near the front, still apparently important in their strange hierarchy. They continued north for another mile before I saw their destination, a small cluster of cabins where a group of survivors had established a makeshift camp. Smoke rose from a cooking fire. Voices carried on the breeze. Basic mistakes born of desperation or ignorance. The infected approached with that same tactical precision I'd observed before, surrounding the camp, cutting off escape routes. The hunter and Emma moved forward while the others remained hidden in the tree line. From my observation position, I could see both the approaching infected and the unsuspecting survivors. I had a clear shot with my rifle. Could have warned them. Could have eliminated the immediate threat. But that would have revealed my position to both the survivors, unknown quantities who might be desperate enough to kill for my supplies, and to the larger group of infected hidden in the trees. So I watched, documented, learned. The hunter staggered into the camp, appearing injured, with Emma beside him looking like a frightened child. The survivors, 3 men and 2 women, rushed to help. The trap was perfectly executed. When the infected swarmed from the trees, the survivors never had a chance. It was over in minutes, clean, efficient, horrifyingly intelligent. Afterward, the infected gathered around the bodies in that same circular formation I'd seen before, making those breathing sounds in unison. A ritual of some kind, a communion. Then something new happened. They began to examine the camp methodically, checking water containers, looking at maps left open, studying the survivors' equipment, not using any of it. They seemed to have no interest in tools or weapons, but examining it as if gathering information, learning, adapting, understanding their prey. Once again, the hunter looked up suddenly, directly toward my hidden position. I was at least 600 yards away, well concealed, making no sound. Yet somehow, he sensed me. The entire group turned as one, staring in my direction. I remained perfectly still, controlling my breathing, my thoughts, my fear. After what seemed an eternity, they returned to their examination of the camp. But the hunter dispatched 4 of the infected in my general direction. They began moving uphill, spreading out in a search pattern. I retreated carefully, using every evasion technique I knew. Crossed rocky ground that would leave no tracks. Used streams to mask my scent. Changed direction repeatedly. It took hours of careful movement to be certain I'd lost them. By then it was late afternoon, and I was off my planned route to Klingman's Dome. I found myself in an area of the park I knew less well, still familiar from my years of patrols, but not as intimately as my usual territory. I needed shelter for the night. After searching carefully, I found a small cave entrance partially hidden by fallen trees. I examined it thoroughly with my flashlight before entering. No signs of animal habitation, no other entrances or hidden chambers where infected might lurk. The cave was shallow but provided good cover and a defensible position. I set up minimal camp and took inventory of my supplies. Food was holding out. Water would need replenishing soon. Ammunition was becoming a concern. I had used none yet, but had less than I'd like if confronted by a large group of infected. As darkness fell, I tried the radio again. Nothing but static on most frequencies. The broadcast about the Cherokee Safe Zone had finally gone silent. On one emergency channel I heard fragmentary transmissions. Something about a final evacuation from the coast, naval vessels, offshore sanctuary. Too broken to get details. Too distant to matter for my immediate survival. I checked the satellite phone as well, Battery still good, but no answer at any of the numbers I tried. The network itself seemed to be operating, which suggested at least some infrastructure remained intact. But who was left to answer was another question entirely. In the darkness of the cave, with just the faint glow of my covered flashlight, I examined the burn scars on my arm and hand, traced the ridges of warped flesh that had become part of my identity. The physical pain had faded years ago. The memory remained sharp. The poachers had been a Colombian crew operating across the southeast, part of a larger black market network trafficking in bear gallbladders and other animal parts. I'd tracked them for weeks, documented their kills, their camps, their routes. I had been prepared, or so I thought, had called for backup, had followed protocol, but the backup never came. Later, I learned there had been a miscommunication, a jurisdiction dispute between agencies, politics while I bled in the burning cabin. I survived through sheer stubbornness, crawled out through a back window after the roof collapsed, dragged myself 3 miles to a service road with a shattered femur and third-degree burns, was found by a maintenance crew the next morning, barely alive. 6 months of surgeries, physical therapy, skin grafts, another 3 months before I could walk unassisted. And then the decision, return to regular duty or accept a position as a wildlife officer in the most remote section of the park, away from people, away from the politics and bureaucracy that had nearly killed me. I chose the wilderness, chose solitude, never regretted it, especially now. That training, that experience had prepared me for this in ways I couldn't have imagined. The wilderness taught lessons that were keeping me alive: patience, observation, respect for predators, understanding that survival often means avoiding conflict rather than winning it. I ate a small meal in the darkness, carefully rationed jerky, dried fruit, filtered water. My body had adapted to less frequent meals over years of long backcountry patrols. Another advantage. Outside, I could hear movement in the forest. The infected were active at night, perhaps hunting by sound more than sight. I kept absolutely silent, even controlling my breathing to make it shallow and inaudible. Through the cave entrance, I could see fires burning in the distance again. Survivors still making fundamental mistakes, still announcing their presence to the predators that now ruled these mountains. I thought about David, Sarah, and Emma. How quickly they had transformed from victims to predators. How seamlessly they had integrated into the larger group. How Emma had somehow taken a leadership role. There was a hierarchy forming among the infected. A structure. A purpose. These weren't mindless zombies from movies. They were something else, something organized, something that learned and adapted, something that communicated through means I couldn't yet understand. As I sat in the darkness, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if the infection wasn't destroying humanity? What if it was replacing it with something else? Something more primitive, but also more connected. A collective consciousness without individual fears or doubts or hesitations. In nature, individual intelligence is often less efficient than collective behavior. Ants accomplish incredible engineering feats without a single ant understanding the overall design. Fish swim in schools that change direction instantaneously without any fish making a decision. Efficient, unified, purpose-driven. Was that what I was witnessing? The birth of a human hive mind? The thought was both fascinating and terrifying. I dozed fitfully through the night, awaking at every sound from the forest outside. Each time I assessed, evaluated, planned potential responses. The predator mindset that had become second nature during my years tracking wildlife now applied to my own survival. Near dawn, I heard gunshots in the distance. Sporadic at first, then sustained fire, then silence. Another group of survivors discovered. Another resistance overcome. As the first light filtered into the cave, I prepared to move again. Klingman's dome was still my objective. though I would need to adjust my route based on yesterday's encounter. The higher elevations might offer safety simply because they were less hospitable. Fewer resources for survivors meant fewer targets for the infected to hunt. Before leaving the cave, I examined my map carefully, plotting 3 potential routes: primary, secondary, emergency fallback. Always have options. Always have an escape plan. Basic survival in predator territory. I shouldered my pack, checked my weapons, and stepped out into the dawn light. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birdsong. No small animals moving in the underbrush. Just the sound of the wind in the pines and the weight of silence pressing down from all sides. Another day of survival in this new world. Another day of watching, learning, adapting. Another day of becoming the kind of predator that could survive among predators, because that's what this was now. Not an infection, not a disaster, not a temporary emergency. This was evolution, brutal, efficient, and indifferent to the individual lives it consumed in service of whatever came next. Monday morning brought a subtle shift in the air. The wind had changed direction overnight, carrying the smell of smoke away rather than toward me. For the first time since the outbreak began, I could smell the forest again. Pine resin, damp earth, the subtle musk of animals. It was almost possible to pretend for just a moment that the world hadn't ended. I set out at dawn, following my carefully planned route toward Klingman's dome. The terrain was becoming steeper, more challenging. My injured leg protested with each uphill step, but I pushed through the pain. Discomfort was a luxury compared to what awaited if I failed. Around mid-morning, I left the cover of the forest and had to cross a large meadow. Open ground is always dangerous. Nowhere to hide, exposed to observation from all sides. I surveyed the area carefully through my binoculars before proceeding. No movement, no signs of infected or survivors. Still, I crossed quickly, staying low, moving from one patch of taller grass to another. Halfway across, I spotted something that stopped me cold. Tracks. Human tracks. Recent ones, heading in the same direction I was going. But these weren't the dragging, shuffling prints of the infected. These were purposeful strides. Regular, deliberate. A survivor moving with confidence through infected territory. I studied the tracks carefully. A single person, heavy based on the depth of the impressions, probably male, wearing hiking boots with a distinctive tread pattern I didn't recognize, moving at a steady pace, not running or hiding. This was either someone who knew exactly what they were doing, or someone who had no idea of the danger they were in. Either way, they were headed toward Klingman's dome as well. I faced a choice: follow the tracks, potentially making contact with another survivor who might be an ally or might be a threat. Or avoid them, stick to my solo strategy that had kept me alive so far. Survival often means making decisions with insufficient information. I decided to follow the tracks, but cautiously. Not to make contact immediately, but to observe. To assess whether this person was an asset or a liability. The tracks led into the forest on the far side of the meadow, following a game trail that paralleled the main hiking path but stayed under better cover. Smart. This person knew something about woodcraft. I followed at a distance, using all my tracking skills to stay far enough back that I wouldn't be detected. The trail climbed steadily upward, switching back and forth across the steep mountainside. Occasionally, I would find small signs that told me more about the person I was following. A broken branch deliberately snapped at exactly eye level, a marker for someone to follow. A small pile of stones arranged in an arrow shape, pointing toward a stream with safe crossing. This wasn't random movement. This was someone leaving a trail. By early afternoon, I reached a high ridge that gave me a clear view of the path ahead. Through my binoculars, I spotted him. A tall man in military-style clothing, moving with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for a long journey. He carried a rifle slung across his back and had a sidearm visible on his hip. His pack looked well organized, not the haphazard collection that desperate refugees carried. I watched him for nearly an hour as he made his way up the next section of trail. His movements were disciplined, regular checks of his surroundings, proper noise discipline. Military training, almost certainly. Probably special operations based on how he handled himself in the wilderness. As he disappeared around a bend in the trail, I made my decision. I would continue to follow, maintain observation, but not make contact yet. Unknown variables were dangerous. This man might be a valuable ally, or he might be the kind of survivor who would kill for supplies without hesitation. I continued on his trail until late afternoon, staying well back. He was definitely headed to Klingman's dome. His path was too direct, too purposeful for any other destination. I wondered what he expected to find there. The same thing I did? Information? A vantage point? Or something else entirely? About 3 miles from the dome, I lost his trail. One moment it was clear, the next it vanished completely. I backtracked, searched in widening circles, nothing. He had either implemented suddenly perfect stealth techniques, or he had detected me and deliberately broken contact. I proceeded with extreme caution, all senses heightened. The forest had gone quiet again. That unnatural silence that had become the harbinger of danger in this new world. Then I heard it, the faint click of a safety being disengaged. "That's far enough," a voice said from somewhere to my left. "Hands where I can see them." Slowly. I complied, raising my hands shoulder height, palms forward, non-threatening. "Turn around." Slowly. I turned, saw nothing but forest. "Your pack, on the ground. Now." I shrugged out of my pack carefully, keeping my movements deliberate and telegraphed. Set it on the ground at my feet. "Step away from the pack. 5 paces back." I did as instructed. That was when he emerged from cover, a figure in camouflage so effective I'd been looking right at him without seeing him. Military. Definitely special forces. His face was weathered, bearded, eyes sharp and assessing. His rifle was pointed casually in my direction. Not directly at me, but close enough to bring on target in a fraction of a second. "Park Service?" he asked, nodding at my uniform. "Wildlife officer," I said. "Great Smoky Mountains National Park." "You've been following me for about 6 miles, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why?" "Assessing whether you were an asset or a threat." A slight smile flickered across his face. "And your conclusion?" "Still gathering data." He nodded, seeming to approve of the answer. "You're headed to the observation tower." Again, not a question. "Yes." "Why?" "High ground? Good visibility, potential communication advantage, defensible position." Another nod. "You military?" Number just spent a lot of time tracking predators in the wilderness. His eyes narrowed slightly at that. "These things aren't animals." "They're becoming something worse," I said. "Something organized. Something that hunts." He studied me for a long moment, then lowered his rifle slightly. "Name's Miller. Former Green Beret. Now I guess I'm just a survivor, like you." "Zeke Thorpe," I said. "Wildlife conservation." "You've seen the coordination?" he asked. "The way they move together?" "Yes. And it's evolving. Getting more sophisticated. They're learning." Miller nodded grimly. "Started noticing it 3 days ago. First, they just attacked anything that moved. Now they set ambushes. Use bait. Work together." He paused. "You alone?" "Yes." "You? Now I am. Had a squad when we were deployed to Knoxville for containment. Got overrun. I'm the only one who made it out. You were there when they burned the city. A shadow crossed his face. I was part of the team that made that call. Contingency Ember. Last resort when containment fails completely. He looked away. Didn't work. Fire kills them, but not fast enough. Too many made it out before the perimeter was established. I processed this information. You're headed to Klingman's Dome for the same reasons I am? Partly. Also have information that there might be an operational radio set up there. Military emergency channel. Need to report what I've seen, get updated evac instructions. Evac? I asked. There's still organized evacuation happening? Offshore. Aircraft carriers and large naval vessels holding position along the coast. Taking on survivors who can reach designated extraction points. He gave me a calculating look. If that tower has working communications, there might be 2 spots on whatever transport comes. It was an offer. Tentative, conditional, but an offer nonetheless. I considered it for a moment. I'm looking for someone. My sister. She was at the CDC in Atlanta when everything went bad. Miller's expression told me everything I needed to know. Atlanta was hit early, hard, one of the first cities we lost completely. She called me from a CDC emergency facility, secure location. There's a chance. He shrugged. Your call, but those extraction points won't be open forever. Navy can't hold offshore indefinitely. I nodded. First things first. Let's get to that tower, see if communications are still up. Miller seemed to come to a decision. He lowered his rifle completely. 2 move faster than 1. Safer, too, with someone watching your back. But I need to know you can handle yourself if we encounter hostiles. I've evaded multiple groups so far, studied their movements, documented their behavior patterns. I know how they hunt, how they communicate. And if evasion fails, can you eliminate threats? I met his gaze steadily. I've done what was necessary to survive. He nodded once, accepting this. We moved together to the tower, share information, resources. After that, we each make our own calls about next steps. Agreed? Agreed. Miller helped me shoulder my pack again, and we set off toward Klingman's Dome. Moving with a partner after days alone felt strange. Having someone watching my blind spots, someone to plan with, someone to share the constant vigilance, it was both a relief and a new kind of tension. We traveled in silence for the most part, using hand signals when necessary. Miller moved like a ghost through the forest, each step placed with perfect precision. I found myself matching his rhythm, adopting his higher level of stealth. As we hiked, I shared my observations about the infected, their movement patterns, their apparent hierarchy, their evolving tactics. He listened intently, occasionally asking sharp, insightful questions that helped clarify my own thinking. It's like they're networked, he said after I described the way they moved in unison. Individual nodes in a distributed system. Exactly, I said, like a hive mind, but more sophisticated. Each infected seems to retain some skills from before. Rangers know the terrain. Hunters track effectively. Military move tactically. But controlled by something else, Miller added, something using those skills toward a unified purpose. Which is what? I asked. His face darkened. Expansion, infection, conversion. Whatever this thing is, it's spreading as efficiently as possible. We fell silent again, each contemplating the implications. As evening approached, we made camp in a defensible position about a mile from the dome. We'd make the final approach at first light, when visibility would be best. Miller produced military MREs from his pack, a luxury compared to my dwindling supplies of jerky and dried fruit. We ate sparingly, listening to the growing silence as night fell. The darkness in these mountains had taken on a new quality since the outbreak, deeper, more threatening, alive with unseen movement. "Take first watch," Miller said. "4 hours, then we switch. And Thorpe?" "Yes?" "If I turn in my sleep, if you see any signs, any symptoms at all, you put a bullet in my brain. No hesitation, no mercy. Understood?" I nodded. "Same goes for me." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once, satisfied. He settled with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had settled into the shallow rhythm of the combat veteran's sleep. Not quite resting, never quite defenseless. I took up my position, scanning the darkness, listening to the unnatural quiet of the forest. Somewhere out there, the infected were moving, hunting, learning, adapting. Tomorrow, we would reach Klingman's dome, would find communication, information, perhaps a way out of these mountains. Or perhaps just another dead end in a world running out of options. Either way, I was no longer alone. For better or worse, I had a partner in this struggle. Someone to watch the darkness with me. Someone who understood what we were facing. And in this new world of predator and prey, that might make all the difference. I woke to Miller's hand on my shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal signal for silence. It was still dark, a few hours before dawn on Tuesday morning. I'd taken the second watch after Miller woke me at midnight, but must have dozed off despite my best intentions. A potentially fatal mistake in this new world. He pointed downslope, mouthing the words, "They're coming." I listened, hearing it now, the faint sound of movement through the underbrush, the wet, ragged breathing that had become the signature of the infected. Not just one or two. Many. We gathered our gear silently, moving with practiced efficiency despite having partnered for less than a day. No words needed. Both of us understood the stakes. Both of us knew the protocol. Evade if possible. Engage only as a last resort. We moved uphill toward Klingman's dome, using the darkness and our knowledge of the terrain to our advantage. The infected seemed to be following a scent trail, moving steadily but not directly toward our former position. We had a chance if we moved quickly and carefully. The pain in my leg had intensified overnight, the old injury protesting the miles of difficult terrain. I pushed through it, matching Miller's pace as best I could. He noticed my limp, but said nothing, simply adjusted his speed slightly to accommodate. We reached the base of the observation tower as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. Klingman's dome, the highest point in the Great Smokies, offered views in all directions under normal circumstances. The observation tower, a concrete and steel structure built in the 1950s, rose like a flying saucer on stilts above the tree line. "Wait here, cover me," Miller said. "I'll check if it's clear." I took up position behind a large boulder with good sight lines, rifle ready. Miller moved toward the tower with that ghostly stealth that spoke of years of special operations training. He disappeared inside the base of the spiral walkway that led to the top. 5 minutes passed. 10. I scanned the forest edge continuously, watching for any movement. The infected who had been tracking us hadn't appeared yet, but they were coming. I could feel it. Miller emerged from the tower, signaling all clear. I joined him at the base. "Access to the top is intact," he said. "No signs of infected inside. There's a small ranger station with radio equipment. Looks untouched." We climbed the spiral concrete walkway, my leg screaming with each step. At the top, the circular observation deck offered a 360-degree view of the surrounding mountains. Even through the haze of distant smoke, it was breathtaking. On a clear day, you could see 7 states from this position. Today, we could see the end of the world. Knoxville still burned to the northwest, a black smudge against the horizon. To the south, similar columns of smoke rose from Chattanooga and Atlanta. To the east, the ridges of the mountains rolled away toward distant North Carolina, seemingly untouched by the chaos that had consumed the cities. The ranger station was a small enclosed room in the center of the observation deck. Inside, we found basic emergency equipment, including a powered radio setup connected to solar panels on the roof. Miller went to work on the communications equipment while I kept watch through the windows, scanning the approaches with my binoculars. That was when I saw them, emerging from the forest edge below. Dozens of infected moving with that now familiar coordinated purpose. At their center, a figure in camouflage similar to Miller's. Military. Special forces. Perhaps even from Miller's former unit. "We've got company," I said. "At least 30 infected approaching from the South Trail. Moving fast." Miller joined me at the window, took a quick look. "That's Crawford," he said, his voice flat. "He was my second in command." "I'm sorry." He shook his head once, dismissing sentiment. "Radio's operational. Emergency channels only. I'm going to try to make contact with the evacuation coordinators." "How long will that take?" "Unknown. Minutes if someone's monitoring. Hours if I have to wait for scheduled check-ins." I did the math quickly. The infected will reach the base of the tower in 10 minutes, maybe less. We can hold this position, but for how long? Miller was already back at the radio. "As long as necessary. This is our best shot at extraction." I took inventory of our ammunition, our supplies. We had enough to hold off a siege for a day, maybe 2 if we were conservative. After that, I returned to the window, watching the infecteds approach. They moved with disturbing coordination, spreading out to surround the base of the tower. Crawford, or what had once been Crawford, directed them with those strange tilting head gestures I'd observed before. They were cutting off all potential escape routes. "This isn't random," I said. "They knew we were coming here. They set up an ambush." Miller looked up from the radio. "How could they know?" "I don't know. But look at their positioning. They're not just following a trail. They're deploying tactically." He joined me again, observing their movements. His face hardened. "Those are my tactics. Crawford is implementing the same containment pattern we used in urban operations." "They retain skills from before," I said, "and they learn from each other somehow." "Which means we're up against an enemy that thinks and plans." Miller's voice was grim. "An enemy that knows my playbook." My fever started around noon. At first I tried to hide it from Miller, attributing my shaking hands and sweating to the stress of our situation. But by early afternoon I couldn't disguise it anymore. My temperature was spiking, my vision blurring at the edges. "You're sick," Miller said, noticing me steadying myself against the wall. "Not infected," I said quickly. "My leg. The old injury. It gets inflamed sometimes when I push too hard. Causes fever." He studied me carefully, eyes narrowing. "You sure about that?" "I'm talking, aren't I? No aphasia, no aggression, just an infection. The normal kind." He seemed to accept this, but kept a careful distance. I didn't blame him. In his position, I'd have done the same, maybe worse. The infected maintained their position around the tower, neither advancing nor retreating. Waiting. For reinforcements, for us to weaken, for night to fall. Impossible to know. Miller continued working the radio, sending out calls on emergency frequencies, waiting for responses. I focused on staying conscious, monitoring our perimeter, and fighting the fever that was steadily worsening. As evening approached, my condition deteriorated. The pain in my leg had become excruciating, radiating up into my hip and spine. My temperature continued to rise. I knew I was dealing with a serious infection, possibly septic. Without antibiotics, my chances weren't good. "Anything on the radio?" I asked, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be. Miller shook his head. Nothing yet. But there's a scheduled emergency broadcast at sundown. If anyone's out there coordinating evacuations, they'll be listening then. I nodded, conserving energy. If I don't make it, I need you to find my sister, Rebecca Thorpe, CDC researcher. There was a secure facility in Atlanta she might have evacuated to. You'll tell her yourself, Miller said firmly. This fever breaks, we make contact, we get extracted. That's the plan. Plans. We both knew how quickly those changed in this new reality. But I appreciated the sentiment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the observation deck, Miller finally got a response on the radio. A terse military voice acknowledging his call sign, requesting status and position. Hope, faint but real. That was when we heard it. The sound of metal groaning from below. The infected had begun dismantling the base of the spiral walkway, removing the structural supports. They were bringing down the tower. They're taking down the tower, Miller said, his voice tight with controlled tension. We need to move. Now. The metal supports groaned again, the entire structure swaying slightly. The infected were working with disturbing coordination, using tools they'd found at the ranger station below. Crawford directed their efforts with those same head-tilting gestures, distributing them around the base for maximum effect. The radio, I said, fighting through the fever fog clouding my mind. Did you get extraction coordinates? Miller was already gathering essential gear, stuffing it into his pack. Partial transmission. Extraction point on the North Carolina side near Fontana Lake. Helicopter pickup at dawn if we can get there. I pushed myself upright, fighting waves of dizziness. How far? 15 miles. Difficult terrain. He glanced at my leg, my fevered state. In your condition, nearly impossible. Another groan of metal, louder this time. The tower shuddered beneath us. We need an alternate escape route, I said. The main walkway is compromised. Miller was already at the windows, scanning the structure. There's a maintenance ladder on the north side. Emergency access. If we can reach it, we might get down before they bring the whole thing down. I checked my weapons, secured my gear, forcing my body to move through sheer willpower. The fever was bad, but I'd survived worse. The key was fluid, electrolytes, and antibiotics if we could find them. All problems for later, if we survived the next few minutes. I'll go first, Miller said. Cover me from here until I'm clear, then follow. We move fast, break through their perimeter at the north edge, then head east toward the extraction point. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The plan was solid enough, though with my condition, my chances of making it 15 miles through mountainous terrain were slim. Miller knew it too, but neither of us said it aloud. He slipped out through the emergency exit, moving onto the narrow maintenance platform that circled the observation deck. I took up position at the window, rifle ready, watching the infected below. They were so focused on dismantling the supports that they didn't immediately notice Miller making his way to the ladder. I saw him begin his descent, moving quickly and quietly despite the awkward angle. The tower shook again, more violently this time. The infected were making progress. I didn't have much time. I started toward the exit, then hesitated. Turned back to the radio. It was still connected, still broadcasting on the emergency frequency. I keyed the mic one last time. This is Ezekiel Thorpe, Wildlife Officer, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. If anyone from the CDC is monitoring this channel, I'm looking for Dr. Rebecca Thorpe. Tell her Zeke is alive and heading to the extraction point at Fontana Lake. No response. I hadn't expected one, but it felt important somehow to leave that message in the void. A final connection to the sister I would probably never see again. I made my way onto the maintenance platform, the metal cold beneath my hands. The fever had me alternating between chills and sweats, my vision swimming in and out of focus. I saw Miller reach the ground below, take cover behind a storage shed. The infected were still focused on the supports, unaware of his escape. I began my descent, each move careful and deliberate despite my weakened state. The ladder was utilitarian, functional rather than comfortable, with widely spaced rungs that my injured leg struggled to navigate. About halfway down, disaster struck. The tower shifted violently, the infected having removed a critical support. The ladder pulled away from the wall several inches, leaving me clinging to suddenly unstable metal. I froze, waiting for the movement to stop, every muscle tense with the effort of holding on. When the swaying subsided, I continued down, faster now, less concerned with stealth than with simply reaching the ground before the entire structure collapsed. I dropped the last few feet, landing hard, my injured leg buckling beneath me. Miller was at my side instantly, helping me to my feet, dragging me toward the tree line. Behind us, the infected had finally noticed our escape. Crawford's head snapped up, and he made that guttural sound that served as a command. The group abandoned their work on the tower, converging on our position. "Run," Miller said simply. We ran. Or rather, Miller ran, while I lurched and stumbled beside him, my leg a column of fire, my lungs burning with the effort. The fever made everything dreamlike, disconnected. Only the immediate need to escape kept me moving forward. We crashed through the underbrush, away from the established trails, using the dense forest as cover. Behind us, the infected pursued with that eerie coordination, spreading out to flank us, to cut off escape routes. Crawford led them, moving with disturbing speed despite his infected state. "They're trying to herd us south," Miller panted as we ran, away from the extraction point. I nodded, too breathless to speak. He was right. Their movement pattern wasn't just pursuit, it was tactical, designed to drive us in a specific direction. They were thinking, planning, coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that terrified me. We adjusted course, pushing northeast through thicker vegetation. The going was harder, but it disrupted their flanking strategy temporarily. Every step was agony for me, the fever and injured leg competing to see which could incapacitate me first. After about a mile of hard running, I collapsed. Simply couldn't go further. My body betrayed me, legs folding, consciousness flickering. Miller dragged me beneath a fallen tree, concealing us as best he could. "Can't stop," I gasped. "They'll find us." "They will definitely find us if you die of exhaustion," he replied grimly. 5 minutes. Then we move again. He produced a small first aid kit from his pack, administered an injection directly into my thigh. Military-grade painkillers flooded my system, pushing back the agony to a dull roar. "That won't fix the infection," he said, "but it might keep you on your feet long enough to reach help." In those few minutes of rest, I listened to the forest around us. The infected were moving systematically through the area, communicating with those breathing sounds, coordinating their search grid. They would find us eventually. It was just a matter of time. "Leave me," I said. "I'll slow you down too much. You can make the extraction point by dawn if you move alone." Miller's face hardened. "That's not how this works. It's the logical play, the smart survival move." He checked his weapons, repacked his gear. "We don't leave our people behind." That was true before the world ended. Still true now. I wanted to argue further, but the painkillers were taking full effect, creating a strange, floating sensation. The fever still raged, but distantly, as if happening to someone else. "Can you move?" he asked. I nodded, getting unsteadily to my feet. The pain was still there, but muted, manageable. "Then we keep moving," 12 more miles to the extraction point. We've got all night to get there. We set off again, slower now, but more steadily. Miller adjusted our route to take advantage of the terrain, using streams to mask our scent trail, rocky areas to minimize footprints, dense vegetation for cover. All the while, we could hear the infected searching, their movements echoing through the darkening forest. As night fell completely, we faced new challenges, moving in darkness through unfamiliar terrain, navigating without clear landmarks, avoiding deadfalls and cliffs that could injure or kill us as effectively as the infected. Miller produced a night vision monocular, another piece of his military gear that proved invaluable. We shared it, passing it back and forth as needed to navigate the most difficult sections. The fever continued to worsen despite the painkillers. By midnight, I was hallucinating intermittently, seeing shapes in the darkness that weren't there, hearing voices in the wind. Only Miller's steady presence kept me moving forward, one agonizing step at a time. "Talk to me, Thorpe," he said during one rest break. "Stay with me. Tell me about your sister." "Rebecca," I mumbled. "Brilliant, stubborn, always wanted to save the world. At the CDC? Specialized in emerging pathogen response. She knew what was coming. Tried to warn me." Miller nodded. "We'll find her. First we make the extraction, then we get you medical attention, then we find your sister. That's the plan." Plans. Always plans. Even at the end of the world, humans made plans. It seemed both futile and essential. We continued through the night, the miles passing in a fever dream of pain and effort. The infected pursued, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, but always there, always hunting, always coordinating their efforts with that hive-mind precision that defied explanation. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, we had covered perhaps 10 miles. Not enough. The extraction point was still too far away. "We're not going to make it," I said, my voice a rasp. Miller checked his watch, his map. "New plan. There's a fire lookout tower 2 miles east. If we can reach it, get to high ground, signal the helicopter from there. 2 miles. It might as well have been 200 in my condition. But there was no alternative. No other option but to keep moving or die. So we moved. One step, another, each a triumph of will over failing flesh. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating a landscape transformed by smoke and dew, and the strange new silence that had fallen over the mountains. And somewhere behind us the infected continued their relentless pursuit, driven by whatever incomprehensible purpose now animated their collective consciousness. We reached the fire lookout tower just as the painkillers were wearing off. The infected poured through the opening, Crawford at their lead. Miller's rifle cracked in precise measured shots. Each one found its mark, dropping the infected one by one. I fired as well, my aim compromised by fever but still effective at this close range. They kept coming, climbing over their fallen, pressing forward with mindless determination. We retreated to the far side of the cabin, using the desk as cover, picking our shots carefully. Ammunition was running low. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of gunfire and that terrible wet breathing sound. Then I heard it, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Blackbird 6 had arrived. The helicopter appeared outside the windows, hovering just off the observation deck. I could see the side door open, a crew member gesturing frantically for us to move. "Go," Miller shouted over the gunfire. "I'll cover you." I hesitated, unwilling to leave him behind after everything. "That's an order, Thorpe," he barked. "Move now." I staggered to the window, forcing it open with trembling hands. The helicopter hovered impossibly close, the crew member reaching out. I half jumped, half fell into the open door, strong hands pulling me aboard. "One more coming," I gasped to the crew. "Wait for him." Miller was backing toward the window, still firing controlled bursts, the infected pressing closer. Crawford had reached the desk now, moving with purpose, directing the others with those strange tilting gestures. The helicopter wobbled in the air, the pilot fighting to maintain position as the infected began to throw themselves against the cabin walls, rocking the entire tower. The crew member was shouting something I couldn't hear over the rotor noise. Miller reached the window, turned to make his escape. That's when Crawford lunged forward with unexpected speed, grabbing Miller's leg, pulling him back. I saw the decision in Miller's eyes instantly. He looked at me, nodded once, then turned back to face the horde. His last act was to push the window closed, sealing them in with him, giving the helicopter clearance to pull away. The crew was pulling me deeper into the aircraft as we banked away from the tower. The last thing I saw was Miller fighting hand-to-hand with what had once been his friend and comrade, both of them disappearing under the wave of infected that poured through the broken door. The fever took me then, consciousness slipping away as the helicopter raced across the mountains toward whatever safety remained in this broken world. My last thought was of Miller's sacrifice, of the sister I still hoped to find, and of the strange new predators that now ruled the wilderness I had once called home. I woke 3 days later in a medical bay aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, an aircraft carrier holding position 100 miles off the Carolina coast. My fever had broken, the infection in my leg responding to powerful antibiotics. I was alive, one of the fortunate few evacuated before the mainland was declared a complete loss. The doctors told me I'd been delirious, rambling about hive minds and coordinated hunting patterns among the infected. They humored me, but I could see they didn't fully believe what I'd witnessed. They hadn't seen the evolution happening, the adaptation, the emergence of something new and terrifying from the ruins of humanity. A week into my recovery, a nurse brought a visitor to my bedside, a woman in a CDC jacket, tired eyes, familiar features. "Rebecca," I whispered, hardly daring to believe. My sister took my hand, her eyes filling with tears. They said a wildlife officer named Thorpe had been evacuated. I didn't dare hope. We held each other, survivors of an apocalypse that had consumed our world. Later, she confirmed everything I'd observed about the infected, the neural rewiring, the emergent hive mind, the retention of skills coupled with coordinated group behavior. "It's not destroying humanity," she said softly. "It's replacing it with something else, something connected in ways we never were." I thought of Miller then, of his sacrifice, of all the others lost to this transformed world, of the forests and mountains now ruled by a new kind of predator, one that learned and adapted with terrifying speed. "What happens now?" I asked. Rebecca looked out the porthole at the ocean stretching to the horizon. "We rebuild. We adapt. We learn to survive in a changed world." She squeezed my hand. "That's what you taught me, remember? That's what the wilderness always teaches those who listen." I nodded, understanding the truth in her words. The wilderness was never the enemy. In the end, it became our only sanctuary, a place that had taught me the skills to survive when civilization fell, a place that might someday teach us how to reclaim our world from whatever new form of humanity now walked its forests and mountains. Until then, we would watch and wait, learn and adapt.
The infected poured through the opening, Crawford at their lead. Miller's rifle cracked in precise, measured shots. Each one found its mark, dropping the infected one by one. I fired as well, my aim compromised by fever, but still effective at this close range. They kept coming, climbing over their fallen, pressing forward with mindless determination. We retreated to the far side of the cabin, using the desk as cover, picking our shots carefully. Ammunition was running low. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of gunfire and that terrible wet breathing sound. Then I heard it, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Blackbird 6 had arrived. The helicopter appeared outside the windows, hovering just off the observation deck. I could see the side door open, a crew member gesturing frantically for us to move. "Go!" Miller shouted over the gunfire. "I'll cover you." I hesitated, unwilling to leave him behind after everything. "That's an order, Thorpe," he barked. "Move now." I staggered to the window, forcing it open with trembling hands. The helicopter hovered impossibly close, the crew member reaching out. I half jumped, half fell into the open door, strong hands pulling me aboard. "One more coming!" I gasped to the crew. "Wait for him!" Miller was backing toward the window, still firing controlled bursts, the infected pressing closer. Crawford had reached the desk now, moving with purpose, directing the others with those strange, tilting gestures. The helicopter wobbled in the air, the pilot fighting to maintain position as the infected began to throw themselves against the cabin walls, rocking the entire tower. The crew member was shouting something I couldn't hear over the rotor noise. Miller reached the window, turned to make his escape. That's when Crawford lunged forward with unexpected speed, grabbing Miller's leg, pulling him back. I saw the decision in Miller's eyes instantly. He looked at me, nodded once, then turned back to face the horde. His last act was to push the window closed, sealing them in with him, giving the helicopter clearance to pull away. The crew was pulling me deeper into the aircraft as we banked away from the tower. The last thing I saw was Miller fighting hand to hand with what had once been his friend and comrade, both of them disappearing under the wave of infected that poured through the broken door. The fever took me then, consciousness slipping away as the helicopter raced across the mountains toward whatever safety remained in this broken world. My last thought was of Miller's sacrifice, of the sister I still hoped to find, and of the strange new predators that now ruled the wilderness I had once called home. I awoke 3 days later in a medical bay aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, an aircraft carrier holding position 100 miles off the Carolina coast. My fever had broken, the infection in my leg responding to powerful antibiotics. I was alive, one of the fortunate few evacuated before the mainland was declared a complete loss. The doctors told me I'd been delirious, rambling about hive minds and coordinated hunting patterns among the infected. They humored me, but I could see they didn't fully believe what I'd witnessed. They hadn't seen the evolution happening, the adaptation, the emergence of something new and terrifying from the ruins of humanity. A week into my recovery, a nurse brought a visitor to my bedside. A woman in a CDC jacket, tired eyes, familiar features. "Rebecca," I whispered, hardly daring to believe. My sister took my hand, her eyes filling with tears. They said a wildlife officer named Thorpe had been evacuated. I didn't dare hope. We held each other, survivors of an apocalypse that had consumed our world. Later, she confirmed everything I had observed about the infected: the neural rewiring, the emergent hive mind, the retention of skills coupled with coordinated group behavior. "It's not destroying humanity," she said softly. "It's replacing it with something else, something connected in ways we never were." I thought of Miller then, of his sacrifice, of all the others lost to this transformed world, of the forests and mountains now ruled by a new kind of predator, one that learned and adapted with terrifying speed. "What happens now?" I asked. Rebecca looked out the porthole at the ocean stretching to the horizon. "We rebuild. We adapt. We learn to survive in a changed world." She squeezed my hand. "That's what you taught me, remember? That's what the wilderness always teaches those who listen." I nodded, understanding the truth in her words. The wilderness was never the enemy. In the end, it became our only sanctuary, a place that had taught me the skills to survive when civilization fell, a place that might, someday, teach us how to reclaim our world from whatever new form of humanity now walked its forests and mountains. Until then, we would watch and wait, learn and adapt. Become the kind of predators that could survive among predators. Because that's what this was now. Not an infection, not a disaster, not a temporary emergency. This was evolution, brutal, efficient, and indifferent to the individual lives it consumed in service of whatever came next. And if there's one thing my years in the wilderness taught me, it's that evolution always finds a way forward, even through the darkest of times.